Hi, everyone. I'm Greg McGruder on the board of the DC Environmental Film Festival, and we are fortunate to have with us two people who were involved in the film that you just saw. We have with us James Mills, the co-producer and the co-writer for this film, and Tyrhee Moore, who was a member of the Expedition Denali team. So a little bit about these two gentlemen. James is a journalist, a writer, a photographer, and he's worked in the outdoor industry field for more than 20 years as a guide, an outfitter, and an independent sales rep. His longtime area of focus has been who is in the outdoors. This was a subject reflected in his 2014 book, The Adventure Gap, Changing the Face of the Outdoors. And last year, Outside Magazine named that book as one of the outdoor books that shaped the last decade. Tyrhee Moore is an adventurer, a mountaineer, and in addition to Denali, he's climbed Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, Aconcagua in Argentina, and he was the youngest person on the expedition Denali. He grew up in Washington, D.C., and was introduced to the outdoors when he was 11 years old and attended a summer camp in Jackson Hole. He was named as one of Backpacker Magazine's Heroes of the Year in 2014, and when he's not climbing, he's an outdoor education advocate, active with a group called Diversify Outdoors, and he's also the founder of Soul Track Outdoors, a DC-based nonprofit that connects communities of color to outdoor spaces while also building a coalition of diverse outdoor leaders. So welcome, James and Tyrhee. So tell us where you are, each of you. James, you go first.
You bet. Hi, everyone. I am currently at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm a faculty assistant here, and this is the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk people and the area known for time immemorial as Daejeop. So I'm really glad to be here.
And Tyrhee, where are you joining us from?
I'm right in my living room in Washington, D.C., where I live, which is now also pseudo my office space due to the pandemic that we're in.
And that is the story that so many of us can tell as well. So, let's talk about this film. And I thought this film did a wonderful job of weaving together so many elements. We have history, we have adventure, human behavior, and there's all these wonderful personal stories. So, taking all of this into consideration, why do you think that 2013, when you made that climb, was the right time for making that climb and also for the creation of this film?
Well, I think it's safe to say that a lot of things kind of came into fruition at that time. I think we're slowly starting to see the beginnings of the diversity, equity, inclusion movement that we're seeing now in outdoor recreation. And back then, the National Outdoor Leadership School, also known as NOLS, was creating programming to figure out how they would very directly engage this as an issue. Having been in the outdoor industry for most of my professional life, there weren't that many organizations that were making it a priority, but Knowles saw that if they didn't do anything specifically to address the lack of diversity, not only among their faculty, but also among their student body, they would become culturally and socially irrelevant within a generation or two. And so it's kind of one of those things where things just kind of align. I had just become familiar with Knowles, having taken one of their courses. I'm sitting in the Lander bar talking after a trip with Aparna Raja Gopal Durbin, who at the time was the director of diversity inclusion for Knowles. And she said, we're struggling with this issue. What would you think if we were to put together a team of African-American climbers to summit Denali? And I said, wow, that sounds great. We should do that. And you had that conversation like you do in a bar, you forget about it. 3 weeks later, she calls me up and says, James, we're gonna do it. And I said, great, can I come too? And so it was at that point we started looking around the country to try to find people who could fill the role of climber on this expedition. And that's actually how we got introduced to Tyrhee, as well as 8 other men and women who just did a fantastic job of telling the story.
And Tyrhee, what was your, your answer to this question, your knowledge of all this history that was so much part of this film?
Yep. Yeah, and I think to the point of timing too, around it being 2013, it also was the 100th year anniversary of the first summit of Denali, which I think represented multiple things, right? I think that one, it sort of given us a real like tangible like number around like this huge number around like how much time has like sort of come between a huge significant event like this from the time that your usual inhabitants have like first been able to sort of go and recreate and sort of exist in this space to now sort of having this very sort of momentous movement to sort of open doors for so many others. And it took 100 years for something like that to sort of um, be feasible for us. And so I think that was pretty powerful in itself to sort of just feel like, being there 100 years after this has sort of happened and feeling like, wow, like it took this long for us to sort of be here, be present, and in the face of so many other people that were on the mountain. And to that point, I think that, it was a year of celebration for Denali. And so being on that mountain was also equally important because there were so many people from all around the globe who had sort of sought out to sort of climb and be on this mountain in 2013. And essentially, if we weren't there, there would have been we wouldn't have been represented on that mountain like during that time, right? And there's so many people there representing so many other nations across the globe. People right here in this nation weren't even sort of there to sort of celebrate this moment as well. And so I think that was also pretty powerful because we sort of really maximized on an opportunity to sort of really take up space where there were going to be so many people on a mountain like that. Because typically, it isn't as sort of you know, there isn't so much sort of traffic on the mountain during that time. And I think that since it was a great opportunity to sort of be there and sort of show up for our culture and our people. And so I felt like that the timing in itself was I think it was coincidental, but it also just happened to be a really great moment to sort of be represented on Denali. And so for me, I think that was one of the biggest significance around 2013. And then to some of James's point is understanding that this was someone like Knowles, who's a huge stakeholder in this space, first recognizing the issues at hand and how it played a much larger role in the overarching like industry in itself. And so saying like, hey, we have to actually make a decision here, like actually be strategic around how we can be first on this. And so to see that now and how it's sort of become like radiated amongst like across the nation, right? And so just seeing how we were like the timing of that was it was just so early on, right? And it was just like such a groundbreaking, right? And like this very sort of innovative like thought process to like even think about something like that. And now we're sort of seeing this like it's celebrated, but also like these new efforts and things are constantly coming. Like for me, daily, right? Like I get newsletters and emails and posts on my timeline constantly of like all of these incredible things that our people are doing. But back then, like to plan a trip to Denali was, this like James said, like you think, this is just a conversation. We'll never come back to this. But now it's become something that can be real and can be touched and felt. And I think that is really powerful to sort of look back at. Because it's not, it actually isn't even too long ago for us. And so like to think about like that isn't even a ton of time. 2013, we're not even a decade from that. And now there's just been so much traction since then.
Yeah. So one other thing too, there is this notion among so many that Black folks were not climbing, but James, you talked about Charles Crenshaw, who was a groundbreaker in terms of climbing, and also connecting this period of time uh, with Martin Luther King's speech and the fact that Charles Crenshaw was featured in Ebony magazine. And I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, you know every black person I knew had Ebony magazine. It was the African American version of Life magazine, and that told you all this stuff about yourself and our people that you weren't going to get anywhere else. Another thing that I thought was so fascinating, and you alluded to it, that anniversary, that one moment where, everybody who was anyone was on that mountain. It's like, what? Conrad Anker is there? John Krakauer is there? Oh my God. Is Lady Gaga going to show so, but one thing I think the film did a wonderful job of, which I think is kind of at odds with what most people think of mountain climbing, is the tedium of climbing and the whole issue of caching. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. And I think so, to just talk through the process of like sort of working your way up the mountain and the
You don't
time.
have to talk about it fully, but
Yeah,
just
yeah,
but just that aspect here.
yeah. And so essentially you're carrying a ton of weight, like you're like, it's a huge mountain. So you're taking a month's worth of supplies, whether it's food, it's fuel, it's camping gear. And so essentially to climb, 13, 14,000 feet with that on your back or with dragging a sled would be incredibly difficult if you were to just do that all in one single push. And so to sort of help alleviate some of that weight, you break it into, parts, you break it down. And so typically what you would do is like what you aren't utilizing in that time, you take that out of camp, you take it up midway, you cache it, then you come back to the rest of your camp, like you'll stockhold like a couple of days worth of stuff just in case you can't get up to your cache. And then the next day you'll take the rest of your camp, pack up camp, go past your camp, your cache, go to the next campsite, stay there for a night, rest, and then you'll go down, go to your cache, get the rest of your gear, and come back up to camp. And so it sort of helps chop away at the elevation while also not having to carry all of your gear at one time. And so in that though, it takes a lot of time because you have to take rest days, you have to acclimate. And so you don't always do that, um, you know, sort of the time in between that, accounting for rest, accounting for acclimation, it starts to sort of add on to each other, and it turns days that turn into weeks, and then you're up there for a month. And so, but just understanding that it's sort of a process, and it's a huge incentive, right? Like it's a big mountain, and nothing comes quickly, nothing comes easy. And I think that that can sort of be very relatable in real life, and just understanding that you can't rush the process is something that sort of has to slowly be worked on. And so I think that that's one of the biggest appreciations I get out of big mountaineering like Denali. It's just that you can't just get to the summit so easily. It takes a lot of work and patience along the process. And so,
And James, any comments you have? I mean, you were involved in the planning of this thing, James. Is that correct in some way?
Yes, but frankly, just in terms of the sheer logistics of the actual climb, I mean, I'll confess that I was trained for it. I wasn't able to do the climb, but the bottom line is that what Tyrhee just described is exactly part of the overall tedious process. But what I find fascinating, and I allude to this a bit in my book, The Adventure Gap. Conrad Anker had a parallel team doing this climb as well. They literally ran past everyone's cache. They did it in like a third of the time because they weren't caching. They literally just took everything that they needed and they went for it. But I can tell you that based on the people that I talked to afterwards, they didn't have as good meal preparation because everything was freeze dried and dehydrated. And also they were exhausted by the time they got there. For this team, I thought it was actually very prudent to do it this way because it had a lot of first-time mountaineers who had never been over 10 to 12,000 feet before. They were acclimating well enough so that on that summit day, everyone was ready. And sometimes you get ready by doing, and I think that's exactly what happened on this trip.
So both of you have been involved in diversifying the population of the outdoors. So, can you talk about this adventure gap a little bit more and why it is important to close it? Tyree, you go first.
Yeah, so I think that there's a ton of reasons I can probably talk about this for days, but I think that um I'll touch on a couple of things, right? So I'll start in the past. And so I think that our black people, at least our relationship with nature has sort of taken many turns in history. And I think that it's important for us to sort of revisit those things, whether it's the traumatic aspects, but also just like the deep connection that we've had by working and milling and sort of building this nation and having our hands be dirty and like really being one with the world around us. And sort of recognizing what our relationship has looked like and how it's sort of transitioned now to become very disconnected, and these spaces have now become more exclusive and sort of distant from us culturally as people, for a variety of reasons. And I think that it's important to now rewrite or sort of redefine that relationship or that connection to nature, however we see fit, whether you're urban, like you're sort of urban inhabitant and you live in a city, and your relationship may be with your local parks or your local waterways, but valuing the ways that you can still be able to sort of engage and interact and be validated in that. But also I think that there's so many um, benefits and like things that nature has to offer you, whether it is physically, whether it's mentally, whether it's emotionally, whether it's communal, and sort of bring people together. And I think that the more and more that we are sort of told or fed narratives that we don't exist in nature, we don't, recreate outdoors, you're perpetuating these beliefs, but then you're also further isolating or sort of excluding so many communities from the benefits of these places that we're protecting, we're paying taxes on, that we've deemed as national treasures to sort of serve our personal benefits for things like recreation and sort of self-healing. And so for me, I just think that it's really important that we reclaim space that belongs to us, but also just understand that it's like now it's our time to sort of also redefine what our existence or sort of like what our existence look like in those spaces. Is really important, and what adventure looks like, right? Like adventure for me is like walking my dog right now down the street and going to the dog park and hanging out there and sort of like stepping away from my reality and understanding if we can sort of really re-emphasize that to so many people that can't see themselves in Bozeman, Montana, that can't see themselves on Denali, and sort of move away from that type of language as sort of adventure or exploration to sort of really sort of being relative and understanding like people's circumstance, I think is really important so that people can really take advantage of the environments around them and really benefit from them. So that's sort of how that's why I feel like it's really important to sort of reintroduce or sort of bridge that gap.
All right, so Tyree, if I was in church, I would say preach, brother. So, so James, talk about. I mean, you wrote a book called "The Adventure Gap." Talk about why it is important to close that gap.
You bet. Well, I mean, for starters, I mean, I wrote the book based on an article that I wrote for Alpinist magazine back in 2012, kind of in the lead up to what ultimately became Expedition Denali. And not unlike the economic gap, the technology gap, there are divisions in terms of disparities of people of color in their relationship with, in this case, the natural environment, outdoor recreation for either solace or healing or, just for escape and fun. And after a long career in outdoor recreation, I realized that there was indeed this separation between who spends time in nature and who doesn't. And I wrote a lot about this in order to address the issue. But I think what it really came to a head around 2010 when we started looking at the census data from that year that indicated that the population was going to experience a demographic shift. And it's estimated that by the year 2045, we'll have what is termed by some as a minority majority, meaning that a majority of the population will be non-white. And so if there is indeed this division between who spends time in nature and who doesn't, that falls clearly along racial lines, what happens if a majority of the population has no affinity for the outdoors? So the urgency in all of this is the fact that our wildland scenic places are funded by tax dollars. You know, prohibitions for logging and mining and drilling and development are based on legislation. What happens if a majority of the population starts emphasizing these priorities over preservation? You know, and so the critical nature of closing the adventure gap ultimately means being able to make sure that a higher percentage of the population actually has enough of a relationship with the outdoors and a love for it that they'd be prepared to protect it. You know, and whether we're talking about just spending time recreationally outside, you know, or casting a vote or backing a political campaign or, you know, supporting a candidate for either, you know, small state or municipal office or all the way up to members of Congress and the presidency. I think that it's critically important that we build a new and dynamic constituency of people who love and appreciate the outdoors, and it needs to be inclusive of everyone. You know, it can't just be the people that we typically see. It's critical that a majority of the population has an affinity for the outdoors, because if not, one day we may lose it.
Yeah.
And essentially, that's the best reason I can express for you is why we need to close the adventure gap. Because once we do, we'll hopefully engage more people in the preservation of our natural resources to ultimately protect life on this planet.
So both eloquent answers. So the Environmental Film Festival first showed this particular film in 2016 as part of the festival. And, you know, one moment I remember, Tyrhee, was when we screened this film for DC public school students, about 2,500 students, and they were treating you like a rock star. So, you know, it's 5 years later, and we thought it was important to screen this film again. And particularly since May of last year, when the country has been undergoing a lot of racial reckoning and addressing the issue of diversity and inclusion. So, you know, my question is, with this climb and all of your work in diversifying the outdoors over the year, it feels that on one hand, this film and all of the work you have been doing, both of you, has been way ahead of everybody else. And everybody now is coming to the dining room table to eat supper. I mean, what does that feel like to you? Tyrhee, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. I will first just say that it's very rewarding. Like, I think that to just sort of see so many others feel empowered and feel welcomed to sort of step up and like speak out and just sort of be proud of like any sort of accomplishments that they have in the space is always a win, and it sort of is something that really inspires me individually, as well as sort of within the work of my organization. And so but also I think that I really sort of appreciate sort of the I appreciate sort of the freedom to sort of really express the intersectionality between like culturally, like culture and like social aspects and identity with the outdoors, and like this new shift in how we view like outdoor access and outdoor inhabitants. It's like, because, you know, admittedly, we were on the side of Denali, and like I would say all the time when I was traveling around speaking at schools and speaking with so many different communities, is like, you know, I'm not asking anyone to, you know, travel to Alaska and, you know, climb the highest peak in North America. Like, you know, and trying to sort of create a connection there that is real, and it exists. But I think that the small, like the stories at home, like the people who are finding space where they are, that can connect to their neighbors, that can connect to their kids, that can connect to their peers, are equally as important. And I really appreciate the sort of the effort to sort of take back this definition or this mode of like what it means to be an outdoorsman or woman, what it means to sort of be, you know, an athlete, outdoor athlete. And I sort of like now how we're sort of moving in this direction to sort of take ownership of how we can change that image. And I think that for so long we were still sort of playing into like what society has told us is an outdoorsman, what adventure looks like. And I think now we're in a position where we have the power to sort of really recreate that for ourselves. And so I love that we were there very early to sort of really stimulate like this new shift in how we have stake in this. We have ownership. And I don't think we had that back then. And I think that have now sort of been able to sort of create an environment where people can now, really own the space as they see fit. And I do think that that is something that I really, really sort of value about like where we are now versus where we started. And I think that I love to sort of see that growth.
That's a great answer. And James, how about you?
Well, I love the analogy of having more people at the table.
Mhm.
I hope they stay for dessert, and I hope they pick up the check.
Mhm.
Okay, because here's the thing. I mean, we're in this moment now, and it's very exciting, But we're just coming off the tragic deaths of more than, I mean, three very prominent people: George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. But other people of color have tragically died in the last year, and so I think that that's part of the shock and the awakening of the Black Lives Matter movement. And of course, we've got a global pandemic. But what happens when it's warmer out? What happens when it's there's vaccines for everyone? The president says that we'll have enough vaccines for every adult in this country by the month of May. Now, we won't have complete herd immunity, but chances are by the fall and winter, we'll be in good shape. The question for me is, will we still be having these conversations then? And so, yes, we were well ahead of our time. And I think that the moment that we're in right now is perfect for this, because frankly, it speaks to all the disparities. It's not just the adventure gap, it's clearly the healthcare gap. It is the birding while black gap. The incident that happened with Christian Cooper in Central Park happened last year too. And so being able to have access to nature is on everyone's minds. The question is whether or not we're going to see the collective wisdom and making sure that it is protective of everyone into the future. And so while we're here now, I want to make sure that we're going to continue to have this conversation after the summer. A year from now, will we still be having this conversation? Because frankly, I don't think that we're going to get all the problems solved by then. And so what will we do to keep the ball rolling? So that's why I'm really proud of Tyrhee, because he started, I mean, when I met him, he was 17 years old. Okay. And look what he's accomplished now. I mean, he's the executive director of his own nonprofit organization, and so he's a quintessential example, of someone who has taken this opportunity and built a career around it, and he's going to be still doing this work a year from now. What about everybody else?
Yeah.
What about the other folks who are, coming into this with a lot of passion and excitement and enthusiasm? Everyone's signing up to take the outdoor CEO pledge, Teresa Baker's diversity pledge, but will they allow themselves to be held accountable for the things that they're promising now? When things are as bad as they are, when things are as good, will they still be working towards it? So my big concern, and what I'm really hoping for, that people will take this story that is very resonant right now, even though it's 5 years old. It's evergreen. These issues are still critically important. Will we
And,
still be talking about them a year from now or 5 years from now, when we have the 10th anniversary, of Expedition Denali? Will we have more work to do? I think we will. So the
well, I
question is,
think
who's going to be there with us?
yeah, well, I think if you two are involved, you know, this notion of closing the adventure gap, well, I mean, it may not just be talked about as an idea. I think that we will continue to close the adventure gap. And, we are out of time here now, but I want to thank, I mean, we could talk for another hour, I'm sure, because there's so many other things that I want to talk to you about. And one thing I want to say, the first time I saw this film was at the White House. And Tyrhee, you were there. James, you were there. And I remember, Tyrhee, I was sitting behind your mother we're in the West Wing. And I said, like, where did this thing come from? And your mother is just like, I don't know, but look at it, you know? So, and we're so glad that you're involved in it. And James, we're glad that you are involved in being a voice for the outdoors and a voice for change. So I want to encourage everyone to continue to view so many more films from the DC Environmental Film Festival. And also make sure you get outside. Thank you so much, you too.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. It's been great.